Muscles of the abdominal wall cavity include the following. The majority of them are going to flex and stabilize the vertebral column. And on one side, they contract or laterally flex the vertebral column. Those four pairs of abdominal muscles include the external oblique, internal oblique, transversus abdominis, and the rectus abdominis. The external oblique is the most superficial lateral muscle. The internal oblique is deep to that external oblique, and the fibers go in the opposite direction. The deepest of all of these muscles would be the transverse abdominis, which kind of wraps like a belt around our abdominal wall. And then what looks like a six-pack is the rectus abdominis. It's a long anterior muscle connecting the sternum to the pubic bone, dividing into four muscle segments, and the fascicles run in a parallel direction. We can see that muscle specifically on this diagram. I want you to make sure that you notice the rectus abdominis, the most superficial muscle, then the transversus abdominis, which is going to wrap around us like a belt, as well as the internal and external oblique. And notice on the right-hand side of this diagram, of this cadaver model, you can see the rectus abdominis muscle shown. Looking at this diagram, we can see the external oblique shown, the internal oblique and rectus abdominis, and then finally the transversus abdominis on the right-hand side of your slide. As for the functions of the abdominal wall, remember you don't need to know the attachments unless I specifically mention them. The external oblique is important for lateral flexion of the vertebral column. It flexes the vertebral column and compresses the abdominal wall. So it's used in forced exhalation. The internal oblique is also for lateral flexion of the vertebral column, flexes the vertebral column, and also compresses the abdominal wall. The remaining two muscles of the abdominal wall are the transverse abdominis and the rectus abdominis. And the function of the transversus abdominis is also lateral flexion of the vertebral column, and that it compresses the abdominal wall and used in forced exhalation. The rectus abdominis, its major function is that it's going to flex the abdominal wall, also compressing the abdominal wall, and also used in forced exhalation. So the next part of the PowerPoint is actually in chapter 12, which is appendicular muscles. Remember, these are the muscles that are going to control the upper limb as well as the rest of the body. So they control the upper limb and lower limbs and pectoral and pelvic girdles. And they're grouped by location, so where they're found at on what specific part of the skeleton. And they're called, instead of using the term origins and insertions, they're going to be proximal attachments and distal attachments for these appendicular muscles. So the distal attachment is on the bone that is most likely to actually move. The proximal attachment is on a bone that is less likely to move, or the immobile bone. So on this slide here, we can see the anterior muscles associated with the scapula and the proximal upper limb. So notice the top of the trapezius, deltoid pectoralis major, biceps brachii, latissimus dorsi. And on the right-hand side, we can see the biceps brachii, latissimus dorsi, serratus anterior, teres major. And on our next slide, we can see an image on the right of the slide, which is showing the rhomboids. So notice where they are located. And you can also see them on the diagram to the left on the left-hand side of the slide, specifically the rhomboid major. And the shape of it is very unique in how it looks. So we have the rhomboid major, or minor rather, and there's also a rhomboid major. So this is actually the rhomboid major that's on the cadaver image. And it's also important to notice some of the important muscles that are involved with the rotator cuff, which we will be talking about coming up. So some of the thoracic muscles that move the pectoral girdle are the pectoralis minor, which is going to protract the scapula and also to pull it downward, so to depress the scapula. The serratus anterior, it's so named because it kind of looks like a serrated knife. It's an agonist to scapula protraction, so it works alongside the pectoralis minor. The top part of it is going to rotate the scapula, but it's a large, saw-toothed, flat, fan-shaped muscle that's positioned specifically between the ribs and the scapula. And again, the attachments and the innervations you can ignore. Other example of thoracic muscles would be the rhomboid major, which you saw on that image of the cadaver. It specifically elevates the scapula, retracts or adducts the scapula, and also inferiorly rotates it. The rhomboid minor elevates the scapula, retracts it, and inferiorly rotates the scapula. So it essentially has the same function as the rhomboid major. And the final muscle that's actually listed on this chart is the trapezius muscle. So named because it looks like a trapezoid. It's on the posterior surface, but we can see a little bit of the anterior surface when we look at the anterior position of a muscle model. It elevates the scapula and retracts the scapula and depresses the scapula. So the description of the trapezius is that it's a diamond-shaped muscle that extends from the skull and vertebral column to the pectoral girdle laterally.